Any pro tips on putting in little clauses, whether that's like a holdback, like where do holdbacks come in place, like at what kind of monetary value? Yeah, just kind of walk us through some of that stuff.
No, it's a great question. And, looking at you there, Matt, in terms of your world a little bit per se, but the standard form contract, I think, does a good job of really getting the general essence of what a purchase transaction should look like. Of course, it's always those additional items there that we have to put some thought to in terms of what that looks like. And so I think the one you raised, Taylor, was a holdback. And, typically you see a holdback if there's some sort of action step, usually on a seller, for something to be done to the property. And really the incentive is of that if said thing is not done by closing or by a period of time after closing, money is held back as sort of a mechanism to ensure that that thing is done. And so that's where you see holdbacks is, does something have to be replaced? Does something have to be repaired? Is there an outstanding permit or something that is really needed for the buyer to really fit their intentions of what this property is and really what the transaction is? Unfortunately, holdbacks, the essence makes sense. We're holding back money until something's done, but they get incredibly technical because unfortunately what happens is deal closes, holdbacks in place. And then what happens if seller doesn't do what they say they're going to do, or seller says what they're going to do and buyer doesn't think it was done properly, and you really have nothing to point to in the contract or the holdback language. And so there unfortunately are a lot of disputes or ongoing issues with holdbacks if they're not drafted properly or really just have fully encompassing consideration for how that process is to be played out. So definitely I tie that back to legal. Like if we have a due diligence period, and that's something the lawyer is looking at as part of the contract. Absolutely. If there's holdback language, part of our role is to think that through and sometimes wear our worst case scenario hat, make sure that holdback language would address that properly.
You said something there that, it's kind of the expectation, like the seller thought they did something to the right standard and the buyer thinks they didn't. Like unit has to be professionally cleaned or carpets have to be cleaned before, possession's taken over. Like, what is the recourse there? Because really it comes down to the buyer comes in and says, I don't think this was clean. Show me a receipt. And then they show them a receipt. And then like they're in this, I'm going to take you to small claims for $400 kind of thing. Like, obviously you guys are probably not going to get involved at that level. That's kind of like where the buyer and the seller agent, put their heads together and see what they can resolve. But are clauses like, a unit being professionally cleaned? Like, is that reasonable to put in? Like,
I would say definitely reasonable. And any of these clauses that do get in the contract, that is evidence to a court, if it ever goes there, what was the intention of the parties as it relates to the transaction, specifically an item in the contract, whether it be the cleanliness of the home or otherwise. But it's something that, on the buyer side, you do have to advise your clients to a certain extent as you get to closing. And obviously, there's terms in the contract and rights and obligations of both sides. And there is a discussion with clients that this is what you're legally entitled to. Contractually, this is what is supposed to happen. But what happens if it's not? And so first off, for the vast majority, I would say 99% of these terms, they are not material in the sense that you cannot back out of a deal if the home is not professionally clean when they say it's going to, or there is some damage found to the property. Material, it's got to go to the essence of the contract. Are you still getting the home you said you were going to get, or the contract contemplated you getting? And so that is something that client has to understand, is that if you do find out about an issue, whether before closing or on the day of closing, it's not material. It doesn't give you an out. You can't not close on that basis.
A lot of people do walkthroughs day before closing.
Yeah.
And like you just said, even if they walk through and the place is not clean, they really at that point are in the same position then as if they were a couple of days later to ask for money off. Or
they are. The walkthrough can always be a good thing to, like you said, you can be proactive in that regard to see what are we getting into here as we get to closing. And sometimes, that can lead to discussion between counsel as to, hey, it's not clean. Contract says your client will be in breach of a term. Can we negotiate a holdback at that point? Is this something that the seller is willing to engage in that regard? But if not, if there's a refusal, there's a rejection in that. Ultimately, you're going to close on a deal, and then it's up to the client, the buyer at that point, if they want to pursue a remedy. I tell clients, ultimately, you're going to have to decide how much time, money, and emotion you want to put into this. Some clients will pursue a $300 cleaning bill. It's on principle and something they're comfortable pursuing through small claims, and they're fully entitled to do that. Other times, it depends on the price tag. If there's water damage that's discovered once we're in there and it was clearly contemplated, or it was a misrepresentation that could cost tens of thousands of dollars, then obviously there's potentially more of an appetite to pursue that through legal means. And so every client's different, but I think part of our job as part of the closing process is just to be very clear of how that works. Because I think, to your point, Taylor and Matt, there's sometimes this, unfortunately, as much as we wish we were the Harvey Specter or the Bulldog, we can't just magically make the place clean and they're going to pay for it on closing, for your example there.
Yeah, it's tough because we make these perfect contracts and we add everything in there, but not a lot of teeth. There is for the bigger things, right? Like you mentioned, there is for sure, but for the smaller things, there's not a lot of teeth behind them.
And you assume that, parties are going to work in good faith. There actually is a common law doctrine of courts have looked at this in terms of parties have to negotiate and engage in a transaction in good faith. And sometimes that comes up too, and they're going to say, well, I'm going to go after the other side because they weren't acting in good faith. And that can be appreciated. But, again, the practical element of that, and Pushor Mitchell, we're a full service firm and we have litigators who can help. But, a bad faith argument, you're looking at 10 to 20 grand minimum just to start that claim, right?
That's what I mean. So unless you are feeling capable enough to go to small claims yourself, what's the dollar figure where it even makes sense to even do that? Because even if you do it yourself, it's a time commitment, emotional commitment. You got to learn the court system.
Well, even if you win in small claims, then how do you then collect?
Then how do you collect? Yeah,
it's just an ongoing thing forever. I think the point of the contract from where I stand is two people communicating expectations, right? And if one person doesn't kind of follow through with that exactly how the other person doesn't want to, you kind of take it on the chin unless it's a bigger line item, obviously.
I think you nailed it there, Taylor. It is. And I mean, we almost all sound a bit jaded here talking about the process, but I think circling back to really our role is just to ensure our client understands that process, the pros and the cons. And I mean, ultimately they can decide how they want to go forward if that situation were to arise. And obviously with good advisors, with the realtors, if they can identify an issue as part of the initial contract stage, and I'm going back to that holdback language, that's something that's always good if the lawyer can get involved in that too. And you can kind of work through those different iterations of what could happen and making sure that the client is protected there.
From a realtor perspective, it's just about setting expectations. If you're going into a house that is just a dirty place and they've lived there for a long time, you just have to tell your buyer, their version of clean is not going to be what your version of clean is. So even if it gets clean, you're probably still going to want to get your own cleaner there. Right? And all those kinds of things. For realtors, basically our job is to make people agree. We have to some compromise and negotiate and get everything to get people to agree. But if they don't agree, I guess it falls on the lawyers and the litigators after that.
You nailed it, right? I mean, we're here to try to facilitate what the parties have agreed to, but intentional or otherwise, things happen.